Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Bella here. In today's video, I'm going to talk about some of the questions we may run into when working on our pronunciation. If you're interested, please keep watching. If you find the content helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss a video with me. Without further ado, let's get started. Not every English learner wants to spend too much time working on their pronunciation, and that is completely fine. As long as you have some idea of what your priorities are, it is really up to you what you choose to invest your time in. If you are familiar with my channel, you would know that I have been a huge fan of American accent, and I was very determined to speak like a native speaker. From the time when I started practicing the vowels until now, 16 years later, I have tried many different ways to improve my pronunciation, to imitate how Native American speakers talk, and somewhere in between to eventually sound like myself. From my own experience as well as my observations of my students over the years, I have put together some questions that we might stumble upon at some point. I will try to provide some answers for them, and the intention here is to draw your attention to these common concerns and to hopefully provide some insights for your own learning process. The first question is when to learn the pronunciation of vowels and consonants and when to work on intonation, stresses, pauses, and so on. Personally, I believe your major progress will happen when you acquire the correct pronunciation of the vowels and consonants and are able to pronounce the sounds the same way in words and sentences. This alone is a long process and could take us months to years to finally get there. If you're like most of us who did not have access to English-speaking teachers and who were taught not to pay much attention to our pronunciation, you're very likely to have been pronouncing words in a problematic way for at least 8 to 10 years or even more. Most of the sounds have been so deeply rooted in your brain that it would be extremely challenging at the beginning for you to relearn the proper way of pronouncing them. It's like trying to acquire a new habit to replace the old one. It would be our knee-jerk reaction to return to the old way of pronouncing everything when we're not paying attention. But once you get over the initial hurdle, things will get better much faster. Another question we might have is whether to work on the few sounds that we think we have problem with or to relearn the whole thing. For most people, my recommendation would almost always be to relearn the whole thing. Most of us don't really have a good grasp of how our pronunciation really is. It might feel like we're only uncertain about a few words, but the reality is often much more undesirable. You might be surprised to learn that 90% of the words are not pronounced in the correct way. A lot of them you never even paid attention to before. And that's the problem. We often wonder why we sound so different from native English speakers when we can pronounce individual words correctly. In the sentence, what is it? With the 3 most simple words that we probably have used thousands of times, are you really pronouncing them correctly? Is it the W sound w in what or the it sound in it and is? Now, when we put them all together, do you sound like this? What is it? I guess my point here is to speak like a native speaker, we really need to get down to the nitty-gritty and master all the details. Of course, not everyone wants to or needs to relearn the English pronunciation, and it really depends on whether you can afford the time needed for the process. Looking back, however, I believe that was one of the best things I did to improve my English. It has made me a lot more confident and motivated to keep on learning the language. And sometimes it's just interesting to discover how fundamentally different English is from Chinese. Another question I want to address here is whether it's worthwhile to do shadowing or other imitation exercises. I've touched upon this topic in one of my other videos. Please feel free to check it out. Whether or not this kind of practice will work for you really depends on where you are as far as your English pronunciation goes. If you are at a point where you've learned the proper way to pronounce all the words, it might be helpful for you to listen to your favorite TV show or interviews and try to imitate the way native English users talk. You're more likely to pick up details like where they tend to pause and where they tend to speed up or slow down. The more you listen to, the more familiar you will be with the native habits of speech. That said, as most of us would like to try this fun exercise before we really spend the time and work on the individual vowels and consonants, we're not likely to reap the benefits of these exercises. Once again, I would like to point out that for me personally, 90% of my progress came from relearning all the individual sounds, and that's also what took me the longest. The remaining 10% came actually quite natural to me later on, as I already had a pretty good foundation at that point to figure out how to say a sentence with proper stresses and pauses and a native-like intonation. There is, of course, so much more to talk about when it comes to improving our pronunciation. If you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to leave them down below in the comment area. And I think it's time to wrap up this video for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. Until next time, take care.